Welcome to Self-Made Verse. It's March 2026. Your LPG cylinder runs empty and suddenly there's none available. Hotel kitchens shut across Mumbai. Fertilizer plants cut production by 30%, all because of a war happening 3,000 kilometers away. This is the story of how one narrow waterway can bring India's energy security to its knees. Alright, before we get into the details, let me quickly walk you through what this video covers. First, we'll examine the Strait of Hormuz choke point, this tiny waterway that controls 20% of global oil flow. Then we'll understand India's triple vulnerability, how we depend on this single route for cooking gas, industrial fuel, and fertilizer production. Next, we'll look at the government's emergency response, from invoking the Essential Commodities Act to scrambling for alternative suppliers. We'll analyze the economic shockwaves, currency depreciation, inflation spikes, and fiscal pressures. And finally, the structural lesson that changes everything. Why this crisis proves India's energy transition isn't just about climate, it's about national security. Now let's understand each of these properly, starting from the beginning. To understand how we got here, we need to look at a map. The Strait of Hormuz sits between Iran on one side and Oman on the other, just 33 kilometers wide at its narrowest point. Through this tiny channel, 20% of the world's oil flows every single day. There is no alternative pipeline of comparable capacity. There is no easy detour. On February 28, 2026, everything changed. US and Israeli airstrikes hit Iranian nuclear facilities. By March 1st, Iran had done something no nation had attempted since the 1980s. They imposed effective control over the strait. Traffic fell from 130 ships per day to single digits, a decline of more than 95%. But here's where things get complicated. The physical blockade was only half the story. Maritime insurers withdrew coverage or raised premiums by over 1,000%. When shipping LPG worth $50 million suddenly requires $5 million in insurance, and that insurance is largely unavailable, ship owners simply refuse to sail. For India, the consequences are not abstract. They are empty LPG cylinders in Chennai. Hotel kitchens shut across Mumbai. This crisis exposed three distinct but deeply connected dependency chains. Let's start with the most immediate: LPG, the cooking fuel for 330 million Indian households. Here's the shocking reality. India produces only 40% of its LPG domestically. We import the rest, and more than 90% of those imports come from West Asian suppliers through the Strait of Hormuz. Unlike crude oil, LPG cannot be stored easily. There are no strategic reserves. The second vulnerability is industrial fuel, crude oil, and liquefied natural gas. India imports roughly 40 to 50% of its crude from the Hormuz route. But here's what most people don't know. LNG and LPG are completely different. LNG is natural gas cooled to minus 162 degrees for transport. It powers electricity plants and industrial furnaces. But the third vulnerability caught everyone by surprise: fertilizer. Most people think of fertilizer as farming, but fertilizer is bottled energy. The dominant nitrogen fertilizer globally is urea, and urea is made from ammonia, which is made from natural gas. When Gulf gas stops flowing, food production collapses. India's fertilizer exposure runs deeper than most realize. We produce 87% of our urea domestically. Sounds good, right? But the domestic production requires natural gas as its raw material, and 70 to 80% of that gas cost determines the final urea price. Most of that gas imported as LNG from Qatar through Hormuz. And the number that changes everything? India imports 86% of the natural gas needed for domestic urea production from West Asia. Think about that. Our so-called domestic fertilizer industry is almost entirely dependent on a single region 3,000 kilometers away. Let's put this in perspective with hard data. Every day, approximately 20 million barrels of oil flow through the Strait of Hormuz. That's 20% of global supply. For LNG, it's 17%. But here's the kicker. The Gulf region produces 46% of global urea exports. The timing makes this crisis particularly brutal. It's now the spring planting season when countries typically purchase fertilizers for the next harvest. India's Kharif sowing begins in June. If gas supply disruption continues through May, there will be no time to build buffer stocks before planting begins. So what does all this mean? The economic shockwaves are already visible. Every $10 increase in oil prices typically cuts India's GDP growth by 0.1 to 0.2 percentage points. But this crisis is different. HSBC estimates a potential 25% shortfall in natural gas supply could shave 25 basis points from GDP growth if it lasts just one quarter. The currency dimension compounds the damage. MUFG research sees the Indian rupee as vulnerable, likely rising above 95 levels against the dollar. In a worst-case scenario with oil sustained at $120 per barrel, they see USD INR hitting 97.5 and even higher. Higher oil prices increase dollar demand, which weakens the rupee, which makes oil imports more expensive still, a vicious cycle. The fertilizer impact hits the budget directly. CRISIL estimates this could increase the central fertilizer subsidy bill by as much as 25,000 crore rupees, adding fresh pressure to a budget already projected at 1.71 trillion for the upcoming fiscal year. That's a 15% increase in subsidy costs. Given this reality, what can be done? India's response has been swift and multi-pronged. On March 10th, the government invoked the Essential Commodities Act of 1955, establishing a 4-tier priority system for gas allocation. Households first, fertilizers second, industry third. Is crisis rationing? The government ramped up domestic refinery production by 40%, bringing daily LPG output to 50,000 tons, more than 60% of daily requirement. Over and above this, 800,000 tons of assured LPG cargoes are already secured and en route from the US, Russia, Australia and other countries. This is the geographic equivalent of rerouting supply chains when one channel blocks. Prime Minister Modi addressed Parliament on March 23rd, noting that India's strategic petroleum reserves are being deployed. These underground caverns at Padur, Visakhapatnam and Mangalore cover approximately 74 days of imports. But here's the gap. India has no strategic LPG reserves. The cooking fuel for 90 crore Indians depends entirely on current shipments. But the structural lessons of this war go far beyond emergency management. This crisis has permanently revealed 5 critical truths about India's energy architecture. The first and most glaring missing piece. LPG reserves are the missing link in India's energy security architecture. We have strategic petroleum reserves for crude oil. We have no strategic LPG reserves. Given that LPG is the cooking fuel for 90 crore Indians and 90% of imports transit one choke point, this is an extraordinary omission in national planning. Building strategic LPG reserves must now be treated as a national security investment. The green energy transition is not idealism, it is geopolitical realism. Every solar panel installed in India, every electric vehicle on Indian roads, every green hydrogen plant commissioned reduces the volume of LPG, LNG, and crude oil that must transit the Strait of Hormuz. The National Green Hydrogen Mission and India's 500 gigawatt renewable target by 2030 are acts of national security. India's energy lockdown of March 2026 is not just a story about one war in one region. It's a story about decades of deferred decisions. The choice not to build LPG reserves. The choice not to accelerate domestic gas production. The choice to remain structurally dependent on a single geographic corridor. The war will end. The vulnerability will remain until India builds the domestic renewable capacity, the strategic reserves, and the diplomatic architecture to ensure that no single waterway can ever again determine whether 330 million households can cook their evening meal. That's the real lesson of this crisis. If this deep dive into India's energy vulnerabilities helped you understand the complex connections between geopolitics and your daily life, please like this video and subscribe to Self-Made Verse. We break down the most important current affairs for your UPSC preparation. Until next time, keep learning, keep growing. Alright, with those key insights in mind, here are the 5 essential takeaways you must remember about India's energy lockdown. First, the Strait of Hormuz controls 20% of global oil and gas. No alternative pipeline exists. Second, India imports 60% of LPG from this single route, with zero strategic reserves. Third, our domestic fertilizer production depends on imported West Asian gas. Fourth, currency depreciation creates a vicious cycle, making energy imports costlier. And fifth, green energy transition is now a national security imperative, not just climate policy. Now, why does this matter for your UPSC preparation? For prelims, focus on the Strait of Hormuz as a critical choke point, India's LPG import dependency figures, and the Essential Commodities Act provisions. For mains GS3, analyze how energy security intersects with food security through fertilizer supply chains. For essay writing, this crisis demonstrates how geopolitical events cascade through economic systems. And for the interview, be ready to discuss India's energy diversification strategy and the role of renewable energy in reducing import dependence.